Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Stephanie Bowen. Stephanie is editor of the award-winning Wilson Quarterly, and we're also joined by one of her contributors, Melody Schreiber, a journalist and editor of the book What We Didn't Expect, Personal Stories About Premature Birth. Melody is also a contributor, as I mentioned, to the new WQ, and her article is titled Setting Our Sights by the Northern Lights, and we'll tell you what that intriguing title means in just a moment. But first, welcome, Stephanie. Congratulations on the launch of the new issue, The New North. Tell us about it. Give us an overview.
Thank you, John. It's so nice to be here. As you said, our issue is titled The New North, and it's all about the Arctic. We are seeing really some dramatic shifts in the Arctic right now. And when we look at everything, a lot is really stemming from climate change, and it's creating different dynamics in terms of geopolitical landscapes, in terms of security landscapes, and economic opportunities, social challenges, environmental challenges. And it's really creating such a shift in the Arctic that we wanted to dedicate a whole issue to it. We did do an issue less than 5 years ago on the Arctic, but we felt that things had shifted enough that it was time to put our attention to it again.
And tell us, who are some of the contributors?
Oh my gosh, we have a terrific roster of contributors, including Melody, who you'll speak with later. But we have 2 U.S. senators who chair the Senate Arctic Caucus, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Angus King of Maine. We open our issue with a wonderful scene setter from Mike Sprague. He is the founding director of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute and was recently named the chair of the U.S. Arctic Commission. We have the former president of Iceland and the current prime minister of Greenland, who both contribute to the piece. The foreign minister of Denmark also contributed a piece and talking, very much about the shifting security environment and what we need to do to keep the Arctic a low tension area. We have a couple of scholars from the Wilson Center who really help provide some context in terms of what has shifted, who's interested in the Arctic now and why, and what their interest means for the greater global picture of how the Arctic plays a greater role in global geopolitics. And we also have the head of the U.S. Arctic Economic Council, who I loved his piece. It was really about all the new opportunities, the economic opportunities that are coming forth in the Arctic. And then there's a whole chunk, I'd say, of pieces that are dedicated toward conservation, climate change, and indigenous rights, and the intersection of all of those. And I think that is a really interesting theme that travels throughout the whole piece.
Well, it's another fantastic issue. I just read it thoroughly, and a great lineup of contributors, one of whom, our old friend Melody Schreiber, is with us today. And Melody, the subtitle of your piece gives away the content: Struggles and Solutions from the Arctic's Pandemic Experience. And people don't automatically think of the Arctic when they think of the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic has been the white noise behind every issues discussion on any topic in any nation that we've had over the last couple of years. Give us the overview of what you discovered when you looked at how the pandemic has affected the Arctic.
The 1918 flu epidemic is still really, really sharply felt in Arctic communities. There were some communities that were completely wiped out. Others, where they had massive losses with orphans and economic issues and just a huge burden of the flu. And that's still felt today. And then you also have current respiratory illnesses tuberculosis, RSV, which is a respiratory virus that really affects infants, is a huge, huge issue, and it's been going on during COVID pandemic. So in the Arctic, epidemics are still very much a major issue. And the Arctic is an interesting place to report on. It has extremely limited infrastructure, communications. There's what is sometimes called the harsh tyranny of distance. It's frequently not connected to the road system. So you have, health systems that are thousands of miles away that you need to be airlifted to. All of those work against the Arctic in a time of crisis. But
I'm sorry, go right ahead.
Sorry, but there's
no
also
worries.
plenty about the Arctic that actually makes it incredibly resilient to crisis. The people, especially in places with indigenous sovereignty, there's a lot of community, a lot of looking out for each other. And they really took the virus seriously in a lot of these communities. And the very distance that kind of separates them was also very helpful, because it delayed the virus getting to many of these communities, and they had time to prepare. And the ones that used that time to prepare quite a bit really, really kind of pushed off a lot of the bigger problems when the virus did hit. So they were able to reduce gathering sizes. They were able to even close their borders sometimes so that people weren't coming in. And it bought them time to figure out what we were going to do as we learn more about the virus.
One of the things that you mentioned, previous experience with other diseases, and Alaska, the highest tuberculosis rate in the United States, which was news to me. And that's really an interesting piece of information, one of the many in your article. But what I wanted to ask you about is you list the things that were done in Alaska to mute the effects of the pandemic, to maybe do a better job than other states in the US have done. And what they were doing, the list you have is all the things that we've been told to do. But apparently they did them better than us. What does that tell us about the indigenous populations and the other populations that live there? Is there a stronger sense of community? Is it a factor of those distances and more time to prepare that you just talked about? What is unique to the character of the region that resulted in a better execution of those practices?
Well, the first thing is that the response wasn't united across the Arctic. So there were some communities that weren't able to take it seriously or didn't lack the political will to do so. There were some communities like in the Russian Arctic that were very, very hard hit. Similarly, in Alaska, when they started to lift some of the restrictions, they saw massive rates of infection. So it wasn't throughout the entire pandemic or throughout the entire Arctic, but for the places that were really successful, it was a real sense of community. There's also a very, very strong protection of elders, of valuing the experience, the leadership, the wisdom of elders, and really protecting that at all costs. In Alaska, the vaccination campaign was incredibly successful. It was on par to be, it was at the beginning of the vaccination campaign in 2021. Alaska was the most successful state in rolling out the vaccine. It then hit some political opposition in other parts of the states. But in the Arctic itself, it was a really well-run campaign, partly because they were prioritizing people over 65 right from the get-go. That's the real prioritization of elders. Partly because of that community sense, like the chief medical officer of Alaska, Ann Zink, told me that basically these villages are operating on universal health care, and you know where everyone lives, you know who's at risk generally, and you just can go door to door, sometimes on snow machines or even dog sleds. Sometimes an airplane would touch down, they would do vaccinations right on the tarmac. And so really, really fast moving, but everyone really prioritized it.
Stephanie, I think you've got a question.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me about your piece is one of the innovations that we really saw the Arctic lead on, and that was telemedicine. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and the role that telemedicine played, and what we, the rest of the US can learn. I think particularly when we look at some of those isolated communities that are hard to reach, with health initiatives in general, not just during a pandemic. What do you think we can learn from the Arctic around telemedicine?
So telemedicine in the Arctic has been a topic that has come up before the pandemic, of a way to reach really limited, isolated communities. Often these communities will have maybe a health clinic, if that, and so you're not doing a lot of specialized care. And opening up telehealth, which means anyone with a connection can now access a lot of specialists, has really helped, not just with COVID, but with behavioral health, mental health, substance use, a range of issues. And that could, what some people, experts said, could really be a silver lining for the Arctic and other remote regions. I know even for me, telehealth has been really helpful, but in places where, in rural areas across the US, you have a lot of health systems closing, you have a lot of burnout and staff shortages among the health systems that are still open. Providing telehealth can be a huge help in kind of managing that flow of health services. And it's very convenient in a time of infectious disease outbreaks to not have people coming to the hospital if they don't need to. And telehealth can kind of funnel that.
I want to quantify this by stealing from your research. You write in your article, the average Alaskan travels 147 miles for healthcare. And I just think we need to pause a moment and consider that. The three of us living in the area of the nation's capital, we're 5 to 15 minutes away from not only high quality healthcare, but often world-class healthcare. So that really puts it in a context that I think many people can't fully relate to.
I'll tell you, John, when I was traveling in Nunavut in the Canadian Arctic in 2016, 2 days before my flight was supposed to leave, I found out I was expecting my son. And I was really, really scared because where I was going, there wasn't a lot of health services. In the capital, Iqaluit, there are hospitals, which is great, but I was going far, far north to Clyde River, where there's just a clinic. And my pregnancy was high risk, and so I was quite worried. And luckily I was fine. One of the things I was worried about was, with a lot of variable weather, you can get stranded in these communities for weeks or months at a time. And so, just traveling is difficult. Traveling in the Arctic is really difficult. Traveling in the Arctic in winter with a pandemic and with all of the things that are going on is just really, really difficult. Yeah. That stat on travel too was to seek healthcare, but even within Alaska, even the healthcare that you get can be sometimes limited. They don't have ECMO, they have limited ventilators. Often they have to transfer burn patients to Seattle or Portland here in the lower 48 because of the higher level care.
Melody, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because I know you've covered a wide variety of issues around the Arctic. And when you were talking, one of the things that really struck me in Senator Murkowski's piece, she makes the really strong case for infrastructure in Alaska. And I would, take that probably beyond, I'm sure there are a lot of cases for infrastructure in the Arctic writ large. But can you talk a little bit about what kind of the role that increasing infrastructure, just more broadly in the Arctic, would do? What would it do for residents and also our position as an Arctic country? I don't know if that is a little bit beyond your scope, but I think you can handle it.
That's an excellent question. Thank you. The first thing that comes to mind is we were talking about telehealth. Telehealth is great if you have an internet connection. A lot of the most remote rural communities have no internet connection or very unsteady, unstable. They're not going to be doing video chatting. So improving that would go a long way. Also, one of the challenges of the Arctic is a lack of running water and sanitation in some places. There are households where you're still using essentially like a honey bucket or an outhouse. Really, really difficult to wash your hands when you don't have running water. When I talk about infrastructure in the Arctic, it's not just military bases or ports. It's also what people are able to do. So Senator Murkowski recently announced there was funding for a port in Nome to deepen the port there to be able to be deep water. And that would be a massive improvement in terms of US Coast Guard operations in the area. Right now they have to travel 1,000 miles to resupply to the Aleutians and then go back up to the Arctic every time they're doing their patrols. So just being right there at the Arctic Circle would be a huge difference in our ability to have a presence in the high latitudes. And then also the commercial aspect of having a new port would be, bringing in more food, fuel, construction supplies, really building up the Arctic in the ways that Arctic communities want. And I think that that's also really key when we talk about infrastructure is what do the communities want and need? And it really should be led, I think, by the communities.
Speaking of that, you write in your piece about the impact that the pandemic's had on Indigenous populations and also about their response. And historically, they've been often hit harder by these types of health crises. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Indigenous populations have been hit very hard by pretty much every infectious disease that has come to the Arctic, from smallpox starting in the 1700s up until more recently, like I mentioned, the high rates of tuberculosis that's really concentrated in a lot of remote, rural, and Indigenous populations. And that's across the Arctic. It's not just Alaska. Nunavut has been battling a simultaneous tuberculosis and COVID outbreak in some of its communities. It's difficult if you don't have sovereignty over your borders or your communities when something is brought to you. That's why having sovereignty and leadership is really important in it, especially in times of crisis, but all the time. And then some of the reasons why there have been higher rates is just a lack of some of the reasons there have been higher rates of disease among Indigenous communities is marginalization in the healthcare system. If you have to travel 147 miles to get healthcare, you're probably not going to go for all your checkups. You might wait a little bit if you feel a little murmur. That does contribute to higher rates of hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, things like that.
Yeah, and when we talk about those 147 miles, that's an average, right? So in some cases it's more, and as you write in the piece, it often requires an aircraft, perhaps even a dog sled or a snowmobile or something like that. So we're not talking just hop in the car in the driveway and drive to the healthcare facility. These are really challenging environments. I also want to ask you, I'm sorry, go ahead. You were going to add something.
That being said, like the flip side to that is when you have these strong communities, you can also have a really strong response. And you have that really strong institutional memory from the elders. The Sami community, for instance, the way that they've responded to outbreaks after smallpox, really thinking about what this means for the community and acting in its best interest. It can really, and having also having Indigenous traditional knowledge, ways of knowing, going out on the land, as they say, which is both land and sea, to have mental health breaks, to have food security, and also to do social distancing. Relying on these cultural traditions is really, really important, especially in times like this.
I think there's a really strong theme in this issue around Indigenous knowledge and trusting and listening and incorporating that knowledge. Also really making sure that Indigenous leadership is front and center. That's something that comes through loud and clear in several pieces, including our interactive piece, which takes a look at youth voices and what young Indigenous Arctic citizens have to say about where they live and what they want their future to look like. I think that comes through very strongly.
Thanks, Stephanie. Looking ahead, and I want to ask both of you a looking ahead question before we close. And Stephanie, I'll give you some time to prepare because I'm going to ask you about the next issue and what you have in the planning stages. But before I do that, one of the things that you end your piece with, Melody, is a look ahead to not only what has happened during this pandemic and what lessons can be learned, what lessons can be shared, but also you sort of hint that there could be more to come, in the sense that thawing permafrost is potentially releasing pathogens that have been frozen in place for decades. That's really fascinating. Could you tell our viewers about that?
Yeah, so this is something that's been going on for years now. Permafrost is thawing at an unprecedented rate. And when that happens, it's essentially been preserving all of the pathogens that were in the soil when it froze. So the way that we were able to learn that the 1918 flu epidemic actually started with birds was because of the Arctic. There were bodies that were thawing in the permafrost, and they were actually able to go in and sample the tissue. And because they'd been so carefully preserved, there were still viral fragments. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to get the 1918 flu from the permafrost. That's really important. There are other viruses that have been around as old. The viruses that have been covered from the permafrost are as old as 30,000 years, but we don't know if those are dangerous to humans. The really pressing pathogen to come from permafrost is bacteria. I mentioned anthrax in the piece. In Russia, there was an anthrax outbreak that started with a 12-year-old boy. And it killed thousands of reindeer, which they rely on for sustenance in a lot of different ways, and several people. That is incredibly dangerous. This is probably naturally occurring anthrax, and anthrax occurs in most soil all around the world. But in the Arctic, it's been contained in permafrost in large quantities. And so that could emerge now. You might also have a bacteria like tetanus or something emerging from the soil.
Thanks. And I do some public speaking on politics and media and other topics. And a question that always comes up is, about how do you find good information, the reliability of information. I mean, in just this short time, we've talked about your article. We've talked about so much, and I learned so much reading it. I'm sure our viewers have learned so much just listening to the discussion. There's great value in the WQ. And and the great news is, Stephanie, back to you, that it is absolutely free. So before we close, if you would tell viewers, do a plug, tell them how they can get and read the WQ. And then also, if you're kind enough to give us a preview of what you have planned for the next issue.
Yes, the Wilson Quarterly is free, and you can subscribe. Go to wilsonquarterly.com. We send out an email that announces every new issue, and an occasional dispatch that kind of connects, I call it the connective tissue between the issues. In terms of the next issue, I'm going to keep that a surprise.
Mystery is a good thing.
Yeah.
We'll live with that. Something to look forward to.
But I know I can tell you this: it's going to be very interesting and provocative. So
there's no doubt about that. That's
is. Yes.
No doubt about it. And Melody, thank you as well. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, a great pleasure for us as well. That's it for this week's edition of Wilson Center Now. Remember, log in and read the WQ. And in the meantime, I hope you'll join us again for another edition of Wilson Center Now. And until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.